So I am pleased to introduce our speaker. This is someone that many of you know and love. Aaron Steil is the Consumer Horticulture Extension Specialist at Iowa State University, where he works with county extension offices across the state to answer home gardening questions for all Iowans. Aaron is the host of the TV show Gardening with Style on Iowa PBS and regular guest on Iowa Public Radio's weekly Hort Friday segment on Talk of Iowa, which will be tomorrow for all of you who are wanting to join in. Steil received his BS in horticulture and biology from Iowa State University and his MS in public horticulture from the University of Delaware. Prior to working for Extension and Outreach, he worked for 14 years at Iowa State University's Ryman Gardens and taught classes in Iowa State's Department of Horticulture. So thank you, Aaron, for being here with us this evening.
Thank you for joining me this evening. We're going to be talking about roses. I have always kind of thought of roses, and maybe some of you have kind of thought of roses as kind of finicky garden plants, but they really are kind of a quintessential garden plant in many ways too. And they don't have to be finicky. And we're going to talk about that today here. And I think especially with a lot of the new roses that are available to gardeners today, they really have become some of my favorite shrubs. And um, the horticulture kind of quote unquote, the horticulture snob in me doesn't want to like roses because they're so common, but I do kind of like them. So I'm really happy to be able to talk with all of you today about roses and specifically roses for Iowa. So we're going to start with a brief background on roses. Then we're going to get right into the care of roses this evening, talk a little bit about using them in the garden, and then we'll end the presentation with some recommended cultivars and rose types that you can potentially plant in your own garden. So let's get into it. Roses have been a popular garden plant for a very long time, and they are represented in numerous art and literature. They have been traced back almost 5,000 years as being cultivated. They and that's in China. And many of them, quote unquote, more modern roses. And because roses have such a long history in gardens, modern in this context means the 17 and 1800s. That's really when roses became what we think of roses today. And that comes from the introduction of some Asian species, primarily those from China, to Europeans, who then used those Asian species, which were much more likely to rebloom than those that are native to Europe or even to North America. They use those for hybridization and selection to create the garden roses that we know today. We love this plant. I mean, it's Iowa's state flower. Interestingly, the state flower of Iowa is simply the wild rose. There's no actual species identified. So it's assumed that all the species native to Iowa would be that wild rose. That's our state flower. And there are three primarily native to Iowa: Rosa blanda or smooth rose, Rosa arkansana or arkansan, and that is also called the prairie rose, and then Rosa carolina, which is called the Carolina rose. And all of those three shrubs all have a single pink flower with a tuft of yellow stamens in the center. And so that's kind of the look of our state flower. Iowa's not the only one who loves roses. It's the state flower of New York, of North Dakota, and of Georgia. It's the floral emblem for the entire country of England. It's also a pretty prominent flower in US culture. So when you think about what's the most famous garden associated with our government, it might very well be for many of us the Rose Garden at the White House. Many cultures have loved roses for many years, not that just the Chinese or the Europeans or us here in the United States and North America, the Romans and the Egyptians. This was a very revered plant for them as well, used in a lot of different ceremonies. I mean, we love it so much. It literally symbolizes love for us in many situations. I mean, what a high honor to give a plant. They are grown primarily for their beautiful flowers. Many are fragrant, although we'll talk more about fragrance here in a little bit, but some of the roses we have today aren't as fragrant as the species that they came from. Roses are also edible. They can be used in teas. They can be used, sometimes you'll see them used in desserts, especially the petals, the hips, or the fruit of the rose is used in teas, and um, other kind of uses, medicinal sometimes, but usually more like potpourri and um, and teas and some of those things too. So it's a flower that we have a long history with. It's a flower that might be one of the most quintessential garden flowers and one that I'm really happy to be able to talk to you today. Now, roses have really, I would say, roses have gone through a little bit of a renaissance here, especially in the last 40 or so years. From the probably mid 1800s up until about the mid 1900s, roses were dominated by hybrid teas. Hybrid teas are probably what you think of in your mind when somebody says picture a rose. They have lots of petals, they have large flowers, but they also tend to be plants that are very susceptible to some diseases, and nearly all of them are not reliably winter hardy for us this far north in Iowa. And since probably over the last 40 years, I would say, rather than focusing just on form and color and maybe a little bit about fragrance and reblooming, a lot of selection and hybridization of roses has focused on disease resistance because there's some very significant diseases that can impact the roses in our garden and make them look terrible. And they also have focused a lot on winter hardiness. Of course, the things like form, flower color, um, and fragrance and reblooming are still important, but there was this big renewed interest in creating disease resistant and winter hardy roses. And that's really what's brought roses into a new light for a lot of gardeners. They are no longer finicky hybrid teas. They are pretty robust and easy to grow shrubs that bloom most of the growing season and are easy to care for year to year. The American Rose Society identifies, I think, 37 classes of roses. We are not going over all 37, don't worry. But they do kind of broadly group them into three major groups. One are the species roses, like down in that center lower part of the slide there. These are kind of straight species or selections from straight species, like this Rosa rugosa or the prairie rose that we talked about earlier that's often called the state flower of Iowa. Then we have old garden roses. These are hybrids and selections of roses that were made before 1867. And we have modern roses, which were those that were made after 1867. And you're thinking probably, why 1867? Well, that's the date that the first hybrid tea rose was introduced. La France was the name of it. And it really, I mean, it was in the gardening world in the mid 1800s, this was a huge thing. It really changed the trajectory of roses in our gardens for over 100 years. And because it's so significant, that's the date that's used to kind of classify some of these different roses. So we have species roses, we have old garden roses, we have modern roses. Modern roses are divided into broad categories like hybrid tea, which have large flowers, double petals, but often aren't very winter hardy or disease resistant. We have polyantha, which were developed by hybridizing hybrid teas with Rosa multiflora. They tend to have smaller flowers and in clusters, but they're also more robust plants, and some of them are even winter hardy. We also have floribundas, which were hybrid teas crossed with polyantha roses. The flowers are a little bit bigger, a little bit showier. And then we have grandiflora roses, which were floribunda roses crossed with hybrid teas. And they are also, the flowers are a little bit larger than floribundas, but they do come in clusters typically. Most of these roses have some fragrance, and some cultivars might be noted for their fragrance, but in general, they're really noted for their color and form. and their reblooming capabilities. The other roses that we'll run into out there are miniature roses, which are just small statured plants, smaller flowers, smaller plants. Landscape or shrub roses, which we're going to talk a lot about later. Many of these are the roses that have been developed in the last 40 or 50 years. And then climbing, which actually it might be more accurate to call them rambling roses. They don't actually climb, they just lean on stuff. They have really long canes. And we have to put them up on some kind of trellis to be able to see them well. But you can also let them ramble down a hillside, for example, and that can be really cool and showy as well. In Iowa, the roses that are best suited for our gardens are the ones in the green box here. And I say this because these are the roses that are typically winter hardy. I'm going to talk more about overwintering non-winter hardy roses. It's a lot of work, and I don't honestly recommend it. It's too much, especially when we have so many wonderful roses that don't require it. And so that is a big part of why um, these roses are better suited for Iowa gardens. They don't require the same amount of work in the garden. They also tend to be more resistant to disease issues, which can be really problematic. I got dotted lines around climbing and polyantha roses because some of them are good choices because they're pretty winter hardy and some of them are not. Um, a lot of climbing roses, for example, will survive in Iowa, but see a lot of winter dieback, and most of them bloom on current or last year's growth. So you don't see a lot of flowers if they get a lot of winter dieback. But there are a few cultivars, William Baffin being one, that are pretty winter hardy and do well for us in Iowa. So there are a few climbers, there are a few polyanthas that can do well because they are more winter hardy. Let's get into care. We'll start with planting. It's a good place to start, I think. Roses are some of the easiest plants to grow from bare root. And when you get roses, especially from online nurseries, they almost always come bare root. This is a very traditional way of propagating and distributing roses. If you do get bare root plants, essentially you want to plant them as soon as you get them. Bare root plants should be planted just before they all break buds, so at the very end of the dormant season. And nurseries will ship them to you when it's approximately time to plant them. Start by soaking the roots in water, a bucket of warm water, for a couple hours, up to 4 hours, to get them well hydrated. You can prune back any dead root tips, prune back any dead canes, or back to live tissue on the canes. Make sure that whether you plant them right away or not, these plants should not dry out. They're usually packaged in some kind of material that should be about the dampness of a wet sponge or a wrung out sponge, excuse me. And you want to maintain that because you don't want these bare root plants to dry out before they get planted. When we look at bare root plants, we're going to first try to identify if it's grafted or not. Many hybrid T. floribunda grandiflora roses are grafted. So they have the desired rose grafted to a different species as its rootstock. And when that happens, there's a knob or a crook in the stem that is where the two pieces were grafted together. Now, when you look online about planting roses, you'll find a lot of references, and books too do this. You'll find a lot of references that say keep that grafted portion above the ground. And the reason many of them suggest that is because we want to make sure that we don't have any suckers come up. Because if it comes from the root system, it's a different looking rose and often an inferior one. But that graft union is pretty sensitive to cold temperatures. And so we want to protect it as best we can. So this far north in Iowa, we're going to actually bury that graft 3 to 4 inches deep. So that looks like that large picture there on the right of the screen. This is a good example of how rose culture might differ from place to place. And it does make it a little bit more difficult to identify suckers that might be coming up, but it protects that graft union and ultimately allows that rose to be more long-lived in the garden. If it doesn't have a graft union, which most of the roses I recommend growing in Iowa don't have, they're on their own roots. If it has that, you just plant them so that the uppermost roots are just below the soil line. Many of us buy um, containerized plants, and it's certainly an easy way to get roses established, especially shrub roses. Again, we're going to look for that graft. If it's a shrub rose, it won't have one, and you just put it in the ground at the same level that it was in the container. If it does have a graft union, then we are going to bury that graft union, which feels a little odd because we're going to be putting that root ball much lower in the hole in the garden than we normally would plant something. But again, we need to protect that root ball by putting or that um, the graft union by putting it about 3 inches below the soil line. Water them in, get some mulch on them, and you're going to maintain a good consistent watering, especially that first year. Roses like moist, well-drained soils, but they don't like drying out as much. They're pretty tough plants. They may tolerate drought, but they won't bloom very well. They may be more prone to disease or insect issues. So having good consistent watering, especially that first growing season, is really important. We typically will fertilize roses after the first flush of bloom, which for many rose cultivars is around Father's Day, maybe a little bit earlier some years. And a slow release fertilizer looks really well. Just kind of sprinkle it around the base of the plants, work it into the top couple inches of soil, and you're good. The mulches you can use with roses are largely based on personal preference, but we want a mulch. It helps prevent soil splashing, which improves the appearance of the plant, but it also helps reduce disease issues. It helps conserve soil moisture. It helps reduce weeds. It also looks nice. Just typical shredded or chipped bark mulch is nice for roses. That can work really well, and that's pretty easy to source from a variety of places. There's also some mulch types that we may not be as familiar with, but look really nice with roses. So one is leaf mold. That's what's in that lower picture there. Leaf mold is basically leaves halfway to decomposition. It makes a lovely mulch. It suppresses weeds pretty nicely, and it does a great job of building soils. The other mulch that you can sometimes find in certain garden centers and stores is cocoa hulls, and they look really nice with roses. It is a byproduct of chocolate production. It smells like chocolate for a couple of days after you put it down. You only put it about an inch or so, maybe 2 inches thick, and it kind of binds together after it gets rained on or watered in and is a really attractive color and texture for around your roses. So you can consider that for mulch, in addition to kind of the more typical shredded bark or chipped wood mulch. We're going to deadhead from the start of bloom all the way through if you want. Deadheading is beneficial because it removes those big, ugly flowers and it can promote additional bloom. Now, we'll get additional bloom on most of the cultivars available to gardeners today, even without deadheading, but the shrub will look better and you're more likely to get more rebloom if you do deadhead. That first year, you'll cut flowers off down to the first leaflet of 3, and then subsequent years, so once your rose is established, when you deadhead, you'll cut it off at the first leaflet of 5 on the stem. And hopefully you cut it off in a spot where the leaf is pointed outwards so that when it grows, it points outward. You can also only deadhead for part of the season and then allow the hips to form. They can be really nice for use, like for tea or something like that, but they're also really attractive, especially in the winter months. Many of them are red or orange in color, and so it can be nice sometimes to have those on the plant through the winter. We also want to prune off any damaged or diseased or dead canes if they develop. And be on the lookout, if you have a grafted rose, you'll want to remove any suckers that come from below the graft union. Usually you can identify them. The leaf will look a little bit different often, and they usually are really vigorous growing. So if you see something kind of coming out of the ground and it's shooting up like like an arrow, it's probably a sucker, and you'll want to remove that because it could take over the rows that you want to be growing. Let's talk about winter care. Winter care is something we need to do for those roses that aren't reliably winter hardy. So this process starts in about mid-November, maybe a little bit earlier or later, depending on the weather. Often We do this on Thanksgiving week, which is a little bit later in November. What we're going to start with is tying up canes to help get them out of the way, make it a little easier to work in the garden, just with a piece of twine or some kind of rope. We'll tie them up, and then we'll mound soil around the base of the plant about a foot deep. And you can see that in that center picture there. Often we remove the mulch before we do this. That way we don't just bury a bunch of mulch in the garden. We can put it back in the spring. Then you'll want to fence off that area and add about 3 foot of straw. You can use other materials like pine needles or pine straw. I wouldn't use leaves. Leaves tend to mat down quite a bit over the winter, even oak leaves. And we can see a lot of kind of almost suffocating happening when we use leaves. Straw really is the best material for this. Then when winter's over, we'll just reverse the whole process. Take the straw off, take the fence down, pull the mounded soil off, put the mulch back, untie the canes, and then we can do some pruning at that point. And we usually do that about spring break week in March. It's whenever the worst of winter is over, but before the plant comes out of dormancy. The nice thing is that this is not something we have to do for those roses that are winter hardy. So most of the shrub and landscape roses, most miniature roses, they don't require this treatment to get through the winter. It doesn't mean that sometimes they might not have a little bit of winter dieback. That does happen, but they are much more adept at getting through the winter, even in zone 5 or 4, like we have here in Iowa. And so that winter protection isn't necessary, although you may need to protect them, especially over the winter, from hungry animals like rabbits, mice, and other rodents. And usually just some fencing works really well for that. I want to talk real briefly about rose cones because this always comes up when we talk about roses. Now, I'm going to put it out there right now, not a huge fan of rose cones. And it's not just because they're ugly, because when you look, it is kind of ugly, right? Like, I don't know that I want to stare at that all winter. Winter is bleak enough. I don't need to be staring at this on top of it. Really, the challenge I have with using rose cones is that it kind of goes against some of the things that I'm looking for when I'm doing or when I'm providing winter protection. First being that we want those roses to go completely dormant. That's why we do it so late. And sometimes that can be hard to do when you use these rose cones. They promote a lot of temperature fluctuations on bright sunny days. They can get quite warm underneath. And that wide range in temperature fluctuations can prevent roses from going completely dormant or pull them out of dormancy too early. And then it gets super cold at night and you may see even more winter damage. The other thing that I struggle with is that I don't know any rose that fits under one of these cones without some pruning to be done. And I don't want to prune roses in the fall, especially those that I'm worried about getting through the winter. I want as much of that plant there to get through the winter because that means I have as much of that plant as possible that survives the winter. If I do a lot of cutback, it promotes new growth, which is something I don't want to do in the fall. And it just makes it more likely that I get a dieback further into the plant than I really want. And from a practicality standpoint, these things are notorious for blowing away, which of course negates their help. And we still often want to put straw or other mulching material around the plants, which is just practically really difficult with these contraptions. So I say skip it. The other stuff ultimately looks a little bit nicer over the winter and does a much better job. In the spring, before the buds break, or just as the buds are starting to swell up, is when we do our spring pruning. For shrub roses and those roses that we didn't have to provide winter protection for, we're going to remove any winter damage. They may have tips of canes that have died back. That's not uncommon. When we make a cut on this plant, we want to try to make that pruning cut in a spot above a bud that's pointed outward instead of inward. Roses have some serious disease challenges, and so we want to have that plant be as open as possible. And so promoting growth outward helps us a lot with that. And we also want to remove crowded stems, again, for that same reason. We get better light penetration, we get better air circulation, which helps prevent some disease issues. For our Floribunda, grandiflora, hybrid teas, and other modern roses that are not winter hardy, we're going to cut back all the dead stuff. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to remove inward facing branches. We're going to try to make pruning cuts on outward facing buds to promote a more open habit. And then most of these roses do benefit from cutting the entire plant down 8 to 12 inches. Sometimes winter does this for us. And other times we have a milder winter, or you do a really good job of protecting them over the winter, and we have more growth. And so we'll trim it back to about 8 to 12 inches. That helps reduce the size of the plant, which is often really nice. We can do this for our shrub roses too, but it's not as imperative or as beneficial as it is when we do it to these hybrid teas, grandifloras, and the like. There are some insect and animal challenges when growing roses. I could do a whole talk on insects and diseases of roses, so I'm going to kind of hit the high points here, but know that there is much more information out there to help you with these things. Probably the most frustrating pest that you'll deal with when growing roses are Japanese beetle. They love roses, and they can do quite a bit of damage, both to flowers and to foliage. There's lots of advice out there about controlling Japanese beetle. It's really about persistence. You can do it by hand picking, which is what's happening down there in the lower corner of the slide. Japanese beetles naturally drop when you disturb them. So going out early in the morning when they're a little sluggish with a bucket of soapy water, tapping them into that bucket, letting them drown, and then burying the dead soapy bucket of Japanese beetle is the best way to take care of them without using some kind of insecticide. Of course, you can use an insecticide too, but it does require a lot of reapplication because Japanese beetles are super mobile. They'll be coming in constantly while they're in the adult phase in early to midsummer. Some other ones that we run into, aphids, often a good wash down gets rid of aphids, or we can prune them out. They're often clustered on flower buds or stem tips. They tend to be more of a problem on dry years because they don't get washed off as readily because it's not raining as much. Leafcutter bees, leafcutter bees do a lot more good than damage. It's a little annoying to have these little circles cut out of the leaves, but we have to really question or have to really ask ourselves, what am I willing to tolerate when it comes to damage? And this is damage that most of us can tolerate. And so there really is no reason to uh, do anything about leafcutter bees. They're doing much more good than harm. But when you see this, sometimes you're kind of wondering what's going on. Rose slug or rose sawfly is something that we see. Last year, we saw a lot of it in the state. Some years they're worse than others. They're not slugs, they're caterpillars, but they just look like slugs. And they skeletonize leaves. The good news with rose slug is that there's typically one generation per year. And so the adults lay their eggs, and those eggs hatch in spring. That little caterpillar comes out, feeds until about mid-June, mid to late June maybe. Then they drop to the ground and pupate and emerge as adults the next year. So if you find this damage in August, there's nothing to do because there's nothing around to treat. They only have one generation. If you find this damage in late May, you can try hand picking or using a pesticide. And there are lots of pesticides labeled for this particular insect if that's something that you want to do. Deer and rabbits can be really frustrating. Rabbits and other rodents can cause a lot of damage in the winter. The good news is that roses do come back from the base pretty well. So if you see damage, you can cut that off and promote new growth from the base. Deer really love to eat the flowers off, and that's super frustrating since that's the reason we're growing these things. And apart from exclusion with a fence, sometimes repellents work okay, but they never work as well as we want them to. Um, if you have a lot of deer pressure, roses might not be the choice for your landscape if you're noticing a lot of problems there. So yeah, there are insects and diseases that can be challenging with roses, but it's diseases that we often struggle the most with when growing roses. And there's one big one, black spot, and a couple of others, in particular powdery mildew, sometimes botrytis, that are really frustrating and can cause significant damage to plants especially if left unchecked. So sometimes we can tolerate some of it. There are cultural things we can do, and there are, of course, fungicides we can use as well. But if we don't want to put up with this, we can also use a different plant. Some of the cultural things that we can do to help reduce the amount of disease on a rose, making sure that foliage is as dry as possible, and if it does get wet, that it dries out as quickly as possible. So that means watering in the morning so it can evaporate more quickly, watering infrequently, but making sure that you do a good job of deeply watering so that the roots are fully hydrated. Keeping foliage dry, so not using sprinklers, instead using drip irrigation systems, soaker hoses, or just watering at the base with your hose. Making sure that you do good fall cleanup, getting rid of diseased leaves and other materials that might be around those roses that could infect the plant in the future. Mulching can help too, prevent soil splashing and the movement of that uh, fungal disease. Making sure we space plants appropriately. Again, that's to help foliage dry out quickly from a morning dew or from irrigation or a rain. And probably the most important and easiest way to culturally control for many of these diseases is to plant a cultivar that is naturally resistant, especially to black spot and powdery mildew. We can reduce a lot of work if the plant is just not getting this disease, because those that are really prone to it will lose all of their foliage by the end of the summer sometimes. And you just have this really ugly, coarse, thorny shrub with some cute flowers at the top. If, however, you are really wanting to grow certain species or certain cultivars, like some of the hybrid teas and those that aren't as resistant to these diseases naturally, there are some chemical controls that we can use, some fungicides. There's actually quite a few different fungicides, and you can see them listed there. Any of those could potentially work, but it becomes a regular garden chore because these fungicides prevent fungus from getting established. They don't cure the plant from the fungus. So any damage that's been done already will stay, but it won't grow or get worse when you get into a regular fungicide regime. Some of them are a bit friendlier than others. Millstop or potassium bicarbonate is very similar to baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate. And so that one's a little friendlier maybe than others. But when you do, if you do decide to embark on this fungicide journey, make sure that you are alternating between different types of fungicides because fungicides work differently in the ways that they control the disease. And we don't want diseases to develop a resistance to it. And so by rotating and alternating on a regular basis, we can prevent that. And always, of course, follow label directions. The other thing to keep in mind is there are some disease issues, in particular viruses, that can't be controlled with fungicides. And if we do have a virus issue, often the only solution is to either live with it or remove the plant. Okay, let's talk about rose selection. When we're using these in our gardens, when we're out there looking in the garden center or scrolling online on a nursery website looking to find what we want to buy, we want to make sure we select the best rose for our particular situation. We want to make sure we have good growing conditions. All roses want full sun. Full blazing sun is the best. They want fertile, well-drained soils that stay moist but aren't overly wet. So we want to make sure we have those situations. Often we end up creating raised beds or berms to provide these good soil conditions. There's nothing wrong with that. We do it for vegetable gardens. We can do it for our roses too. We also want to consider things like color, fragrance. More and more roses are being introduced that have a notable scent. It's kind of sad that fragrance was not considered an important quality to include in selecting rose hybrids and cultivars in the past because roses smell wonderful. So if we can find one that's fragrant, that's all the better. Vigor can be really helpful, especially if we see a lot of winter damage on the plant. We want something that recovers quickly. We want something that reblooms typically instead of just once a year. A lot of the old garden roses and species roses tend to bloom once a year in early summer. They may have a sporadic flower pop up here or there, but they're not like the landscape or shrub roses, which bloom in cycles all the way until frost. We want good winter hardiness and we want disease resistance. We saw how much work it was to overwinter roses. I don't want to do that. I don't encourage you to do that either if you don't have to. And we saw how hard it can be to manage disease issues in roses. And so we want to select one that doesn't have those challenges. And we want to evaluate our landscape for pest pressure, in particular things like deer and rabbits. If we have a lot of deer, maybe roses aren't our thing. We very rarely will grow roses just alone. And in fact, uh, I actually much prefer a rose garden that has lots of different plants in it where roses are maybe featured, as opposed to a garden where it's just roses, rows and rows of roses. So we're looking for, these are just some of the shrubs and perennials that you might consider to work alongside roses. Um, there's lots of different shrubs, perennials, vines, even, and annuals like petunia, I think cosmos and cleome look really nice in the same garden as roses. Bulbs are great companions for roses because they come up early when the roses aren't doing anything, and then they die back, and that's when the roses can take over. Uh, Ornamental grasses in particular, I think, look very nice with roses. In general, roses have a very coarse texture. And so when you juxtapose that with the fine texture of ornamental grasses, they look very nice together. Some other perennials I really like, you'll notice that many of these perennials like the same growing conditions as roses. Full sun, moist, well-drained soils. They'll do okay with a little bit of fertility. Some of them bloom with roses in the early summer, throughout the summer, and some of them bloom either before or later in the season to help kind of fill in a gap, maybe. Low growing plants can be really nice as it can help reduce the amount of mulch you might need. And something like dianthus can come, or moss phlox can bloom super early in the spring. And then the roses can take over. I find that thyme looks beautiful alongside roses. It's almost like a living mulch. And when you work in your rose garden, you get to smell thyme while you're doing it too. And of course, looking for different seasons of bloom can be nice. In particular, plants like peony and baptisia bloom super early in the growing season for the most part. You know, they're May bloomers, maybe early, mid to late spring. And our roses aren't blooming until later. These are also plants, though, that have one season of bloom. Peonies bloom once, and then they're just green leaves the rest of the year. So pairing them with something that blooms after they bloom and then will bloom the rest of the growing season is a great complement. And in fact, you often see peonies and roses growing in the same garden for that very reason. All right. We talked about what you can plant with roses, and we talked about where to plant them and how to care for them. Now I want to give you some roses that you can look for your own garden. And I can't be an Iowa Stater, and I can't have spent 14 years at Ryman Gardens and not talk about buck roses. So I do want to talk a little bit about buck roses. These are winter hardy and disease resistant roses that were developed at Iowa State by Dr. Griffith Buck. He introduced over 85 different varieties of roses. And most of them are pinks or shades of pinks, but they come in a lot of the other colors we typically see with roses, like creams and whites and yellows and reds. Most of them are shrub or landscape roses. There are a couple that are not. There's one called Blue Skies, which is a hybrid tea, and it's notable because it was the first quote unquote blue rose. I'll be honest with you, it's lavender. And if you look at it in just the right light, it's got a little bluish hint to it. But in the rose world, that was pretty significant. And so that introduction certainly has some importance that way. Most of these roses were developed by making crosses and planting the seedlings out and then just letting them be and seeing what happens. Those that are not disease resistant or winter hardy don't survive. Then you evaluate the ones that survive and the best ones you can release. And that's exactly what Dr. Buck did. And these roses really represent kind of that shift that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, where we went from roses, selecting roses purely for color and form and maybe repeat bloom or fragrance, to selecting roses for those things, but also disease resistance and winter hardiness. Dr. Buck was certainly one of the people that was doing that early on in that kind of transition. He was at Iowa State for many years. He did most of his work in the 60s and 70s, some in the 50s, and a little bit in the 80s. He also bred geraniums. His geraniums are really great. And his red sparkler rose was the first plant patent granted to Iowa State back in the day. And his contributions to rose breeding and selection are pretty notable, so much so that the American Rose Society gives an award in his honor, to a rosarian that has done some pretty exemplary things. It's not honored every year, I don't think, but it is one that they give out. The largest collection of Dr. Buck's roses that were bred at Iowa State are at Ryman Gardens, which is part of Iowa State. 76 of his 85 cultivars are there. There are some that have been presumed lost, which is really unfortunate. But in the process of managing this collection and trying to grow it, we were able to recover one of them that was thought to be gone forever, called Pippa's Song. So that's really, really great. It also includes some cultivars that were released after his death. So they were part of his breeding program, but weren't fully evaluated and released before he retired. And so those were released later. And they're nice roses too. And this collection is important, not only because it has these wonderful roses in it, but because it serves as a great resource for creating new roses. A lot of Dr. Buck's roses are the parents of the roses that we see in garden centers today. And because of its importance, it's part of the Plant Collections Network, which is a national network of um, plant collections that are noted and devoted to um, preserving them well. So it's a really wonderful thing to have as in the collection at Ryman. So some of my favorite buck roses. Carefree Beauty is a lovely pink color, semi-double flowers or loosely double flowers. When they fully open, you can see the tuft of yellow stamens in the center. I actually kind of like that look. It's most of his roses are fairly vigorous. This one is pretty vigorous. It'll get up to 4 to 5 feet. Winter hardy, disease resistant. It'll get a little bit of black spot on really tough years, such as really wet years or super humid years. But most of the time, it looks pretty good all the way through the growing season. I'm a sucker for a flower that changes color as it ages, and Distant Drums does that. Again, a little bit smaller than Carefree Beauty, has a nice kind of spicy fragrance, and the flowers change from kind of a rose purple to more of a golden or tan color. It's really pretty. So that makes this actually one of my favorites. Folk Singer is another one of my favorites. This is another pretty vigorous plant, has a lovely kind of yellowish. It's more of a peachy color, really. It's fairly upright, a great bloomer, a great grower, and good disease resistance. All of his roses survive winter without protection. Hawkeye Bell is a nice light colored rose. It's hard for light colored roses to look good all the time. You see that in these photos too. But this one has these wonderful double flowers, a wonderful fragrance, and again, that disease resistance. Honey Sweet's a little bit smaller in stature, but you can see that lovely kind of reddish orange, pinkish color in the flowers, which I really like. And look at the foliage. It's just beautiful. Very little disease issues like black spot. Earth Song is kind of almost like a fully double version of Carefree Beauty in some ways. It has a similar color pink. It's a similar size, but it has a lot more petals than Carefree Beauty has. And Quietness is a lovely light pink. It really looks like an old-fashioned rose in its appearance. Again, a good grower, up to 4 feet tall, and also a notable fragrance, which is lovely. So some of the other roses I want to talk about, I'm actually going to talk about groups of roses because many of these many breeders and nurseries will develop programs around rose breeding and then release several cultivars that all have very similar characteristics. And so it makes all of them in the from the breeder or from that line potential options. So the first one I want to talk about is probably one of the easiest ones to find in garden centers right now. And they're the Easy Elegance roses. These are roses that were developed and released by Bailey Nurseries in Minnesota. They are very winter hardy. They have excellent disease resistance. You can see some of the different colors and forms that are available there. Little Mischief is quite small, um, um, only about maybe 18 to 24 inches tall, whereas some of these others are much taller, more in the 3 foot range. There's a couple of really nice yellow roses in this line. There's something about yellow roses that makes them more prone to disease issues. So it's hard to get a yellow rose that's not super susceptible to black spot and powdery mildew and some of those other things. And so to have that lovely orange, yellow color and not have a lot of black spot issue is awesome. So if you're looking for a yellow rose, this Easy Elegance line has a couple that are really great. My favorite by far, though, from this group of roses coming out of Minnesota is All the Rage. This plant is beautiful. It just blooms and blooms and blooms. And it's another one where the flowers change color as they age. So there's all these different colors on the shrub throughout the growing season. And it does go inside, all these roses bloom in cycles. So they'll be really great. And then for about a week, 2 weeks, and then they'll take like a week to recover and send out another flush of blooms. And that's All the Rage does that too. We sometimes hear about Cordes roses. These are roses that were developed in Germany. It's from a long lineage of rose breeding in this Cordes family in Germany. There are a lot of roses from this particular nursery and breeding program, and it's been around for a long time. They have not been selected for disease resistance or winter hardiness for all 120 plus years that they've been breeding. But the last 40 or so years, those introductions have been. And so not all of these roses are reliably winter hardy in Iowa. Most of them are not winter hardy to zone 4. Most of Iowa is in zone 5. There are a couple of pockets that are in zone 4. These roses might not do as well for you in zone 4. They do well in zone 5. These are a couple of varieties that are particularly cold hardy. I see these out there, and so I want to make sure I bring them up because not every one of these roses is going to be well suited for Iowa, but as long as you find those that are more reliably winter hardy, just check out the winter hardiness on it. They can be a good option. I include David Austin roses because these are some of the most well-known types of roses. They are bred in England. It's a program that's been around for about 70 years or so. Many of them are hardy to zone 5, but not all of them. And there are a few that are hardy all the way to zone 4. They're often referred to as English roses, and they kind of have this like cabbage look to them as a general rule. They're very popular as cut flowers. And anytime you look up David Austin roses, you almost always see some link to wedding floral design, using them in bouquets for weddings. They are probably the most popular rose to use for a wedding because of that kind of all those petals and that kind of cabbagey kind of looking flower. They have good fragrance as well, which is a little surprising considering how many petals they have. Not all of David Austin roses are reliable year after year in Iowa. Some of them may be a little short-lived, especially if we have a super hard winter, but they're very popular roses. I see them out and about, so I wanted to make sure I talked to you about them because there are some that can be quite successful. And the three that I have here are noted for being pretty vigorous and cold hardy, which is what we need here in Iowa. Probably the most popular, I would argue almost the most popular plant in nurseries today is the knockout rose. These rose these roses are very straightforward. They are naturally very disease resistant. They are winter hardy, although it's very common to see some winter dieback on knockout roses. So don't be surprised if you see the top 8 inches die back over the winter, especially if we have a really rough one. They're very vigorous growers. They'll kind of come out of it pretty quickly in the spring and give you lots of different flowers. They were developed in Wisconsin. William Radler did a lot of his work outside of Milwaukee. Most of them, I think all of them are hardy to at least zone 5 and some of them down to zone 4. Even those that are hardy to zone 5, though, I have noted see some winter dieback, and that's okay. It just means that they may not get quite as big as the ones that are in these pictures, especially after a really rough winter. But some winters are mild and there's very little, if any, winter dieback. Double knockout might be the easiest one to find in garden centers. It's probably one of the more popular ones out there. I really like rainbow knockout. As you know, I'm kind of a sucker for flowers that drastically change color, and rainbow knockout does that. That's where the name comes from. But these are maybe the best ones to potentially start with. This or Easy Elegance are some of the best roses to start with if you want to try roses in your landscape. And then we have Oh So Easy roses. These are roses that are introduced through the Proven Winners program. They are also very easy to care for, disease resistant, winter hardy, just like those Easy Elegance roses and um, the knockout roses. Lots of lovely colors. This line isn't quite as large as Easy Elegance, but there's still some really nice ones. I particularly like Mango Salsa, very pretty rose. I also, you'll know, I don't know why, but they're all named after food for some reason. Even the 4 that I have here, pink cupcake, cherry pie, mango salsa, Italian ice. Italian ice may be harder to find. I think they've kind of replaced, that one was very readily available a few years ago. I don't know if it's still as easy to find as it used to be, but these other 3 are definitely out there. So those are roses I love. Those are roses I encourage you to look for because they are fully winter hardy, because they have good disease resistance, and that makes growing them in Iowa a lot easier. They become just a regular plant instead of something that needs a lot of attention, like we often think of when we grow hybrid teas or grandiflora roses. If you're looking for roses, and some of these, especially the buck roses, are sometimes a little harder to find. These online suppliers have many of Dr. Buck's roses as well as a lot of the roses we talked about. Some of them really specialize in some of the old garden roses as well, if that's something that you're looking for, some of the more old-fashioned types. And of course, most local nurseries and garden centers are going to have the Easy Elegance, the Oh So Easy, and Knockout roses readily available. And so you can always get them there as well. I'm going to give you a few more resources that you can use. That QR code will take you to Growing Roses in Iowa link that's at the top of the slide there. This is All Thing Roses for Iowa. It has a lot more detail than I was able to go into today about all aspects from care to winter protection, how to manage disease and insect issues, as well as propagating and some of those other things, which is hopefully really helpful. The American Rose Society has a lot of wonderful resources, and they do a great job of providing resources that match up with regions of the country. They have the country divided into regions, and you can find culture information and recommendations there based on the region that you're at. Because, of course, growing a rose in Louisiana looks very different than growing one in Iowa. And then this book is kind of a good book for us, especially here in Iowa, if you want to look for that. Um, you don't want an online resource. Those are those 2 websites. The Yard and Garden website from Iowa State includes a lot of information about all things gardening. Of course, you can get information specifically about roses using that too. But that is roses for everyone. And we can move towards questions now.
What we'll answer one question because I know this is a popular question and I know that it's one that you always love to answer, which is when is the best time of year to transplant roses?
Oh, yes. So the best time of year to transplant is going to be in early spring, just before they leaf out or the buds start to swell. But most roses, especially shrub roses, are pretty tough plants overall. And so spring and even early summer often means you have quite a bit of success still. The only time that it will be really challenging is in the fall. And even on some of our fully winter hardy roses, if you end up transplanting in the fall for some reason, providing winter protection that first year will go a long way. And then once they're established, they wouldn't need it anymore. But planting that late means they don't have enough time to fully establish before the depths of winter hit in. So early spring, just as they're leafing out, is the best time. But most of the time, you can do it almost any time. I mean, I wouldn't do it in the heat of the summer. That's pretty stressful and requires a lot of watering. But if you have to, because you're moving or something like that, you can usually make it work.